Hello and welcome to Classroom Management Chapter 2. This is the first of the video sections in here, and I'm going to try to do these lectures and include all those things that I would talk about if I were in the classroom, and this saves you the time. You can watch this, you can download it. The nice part about it is occasionally, if you need to, you can stop and back up in the lecture and hear me repeat something or relook at something to make sure you understand what you need to understand. I do suggest that you keep with you a pencil and paper nearby so you can jot down a question if you have something. The nice thing about having these lectures on video is that we can stop along the way and even back up where you can't do that live in the classroom. But save those questions and bring them to class the next time so we can bring them up and we can discuss them at that point. Let's get started. This starts off with a cartoon that I found. It says Mrs. Mutner liked to go over a few of her rules the first day of school. And we've all had classrooms where immediately when we went in the classroom, the first thing the teacher wanted to do was go over some rules for that day. And here are some of Mrs. Mutner's rules. The board is filled with those rules. And it starts off with some basic ones like no talking, but then it goes on to no smiling, no sweating, no swearing, no burping, no sneezing, and ends with no dorky hairstyles. And sometimes I know that I've wanted to add that rule to some of my classrooms. So nonetheless, perhaps that might be a few too many rules to run your class by. But this whole section of the book is about rules and consequences. So I'm going to skip through that part and get right into what we're doing. Notice that we're talking about human behavior. We're talking about guys like Pavlov that you've heard from, Thorndike, Watson, and Skinner, those behaviorists that you learned about in ed psychology. So those guys, what they do actually is important because it's in use in the classroom today. We're going to look at the basic principles behind that and look at the research regarding that because, as I said in class the other day, every one of these methods and methodologies that we're going to discuss all have research behind them that say this works. So consequently, we need to be aware of the variety of different things that do have research behind them that say it works. So if we choose that for us, we know that there's at least research that says this can be successful, but it depends on you, your personality, your classroom, your students, the grade level, and the subject level as to whether or not this applies. We're going to look at the role of extrinsic rewards on student behavior in terms of how does that help with students. Look at learning the techniques for applying behavioral techniques in the classroom, and then determine which one of those we'd like to use in our classrooms. Basically, and it says on page 23 in the textbook, occasionally I'll put a page number in here, so you may want to make a note of that. What these behaviors say is that all behaviors are learned, and if you think that's not true, put two young boys in a room with a karate movie. And within 30 minutes, they will learn certain behaviors, and something will be kicked over and broken or hurt. So, obviously, that is a very true point, that they are usually behaviors, these behaviors say that these are stimulus specific. In other words, something stimulates that behavior, something causes that to happen. So, if they can be taught, they can also be changed and modified. And that is the crux of behaviorism in terms of in the classroom. And their final point here is that the focus is on here and now. Not what's going to happen in the future, but on what happens right now. You broke the rule, here are the consequences, or here are the rules, this is the way you should behave. Two different terms you need to learn. The difference between behavior techniques and behavior modification. Now the techniques are used to modify classroom behaviors, but behavior mod is something you would apply to an individual student. Behavior modification is that little thing that you've heard all teachers, especially elementary teachers, say, I like the way Susie's working quietly at her table, which is an indication to all the rest of the students to modify their behavior based on what hers is. And so even though you're using that to reward Susie for doing the right kind of behavior, other students learn from that part. All of that is a technique, but yet what you are doing, that particular saying, is modifying her individual behavior. Classical conditioning is something that you learned about in ed psych, so I won't spend a lot of time in there, but notice that Pavlov and Watson are still very important parts of this whole process. It says, I like that Watson says that learning was the process of conditioning responses through the substitution of one stimulus for another. In other words, if you substitute one thing that provides a better behavior, that's what you want to substitute for the thing that is stimulating the wrong behavior. Two very important points. You're going to hear me mention these all year, so learn these. The law of effect and the law of disuse. The law of effect says those things that get rewarded are going to be repeated. If I do something and a teacher puts a Skittle on my desk right after I've done it, I'm going to probably want to do that again. It's a behavior that's rewarded, and it probably will be repeated. The opposite of that is the law of disuse, where if a behavior gets no reward, eventually it will fade away or die away. It's also called extinction process. Now, sometimes it takes a lot of patience to ignore something. And as a parent, you've heard parents say, well, just ignore it, it'll go away. They're using that process, the law of disuse. I suggest you look at that step-by-step panel. It's on page 21 in the textbook. Okay, operant conditioning. This whole idea is the use of reinforcement for the good behaviors as opposed to punishment for the bad. You want to reward those behaviors you want. It's conditioned by its consequences. And he says that behavior followed immediately by a reward will occur more often. Behavior followed closely by a punishing consequence will occur less often. But notice the difference between immediately and closely, and I highlighted those two words in there so that you'll see. You have to put the reward very closely after the behavior you got so that the student associates those two. However, a punishment sometimes doesn't necessarily have to be right then, but it still can be effective. However, the more distance between the behavior and whatever the consequence is good or bad, the more distance that gets between those two, the less effective they are. I was the child of a traveling salesman. My father left on Monday and came back on Friday, and if I got in trouble on Tuesday, I had to wait sometimes until Friday to get punished. Well, by then, I'd already forgotten what I had done. And I think the same thing happens, if you've messed up today, well, Friday you're not going to get to do so-and-so. Well, that may not have that much impact on that student's change in behavior, especially right then if you want them to change that behavior. So be aware of that. This chart kind of explains it a little bit in there in terms of positive and negative, although I have a better chart that I really like to bring in, and I may even bring it up on the board in class one day. Let me back up just a second. The reinforcement or reward has a positive and a negative side. You see there's two both on that side. And punishment has a presentation and a removal side, which is sort of a positive and a negative side. You present them with something as punishment, or you remove something from them, and they perceive it as. And all this has to do with student perception. If the student perceives it as a reward, it is a reward. If they perceive it as punishment, it's punishment regardless. I used to have a cartoon of two students who were standing outside the school dusting off erasers back in the days when we had chalkboards and erasers. And that one student looked at the other student and said, "You're doing this as a reward? I'm being punished to do this." So once again, it illustrates the point. It's how the student perceives it as to whether or not it has any effect. And then, of course, the last one on the end there is extinction. It says if you ignore it long enough, it'll go away. Okay, these two methods, rewarding and reinforcing, are the most powerful ones to teach new behaviors. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're always the right ones to use. However, the research says it leads to an increase in the desired behavior, and that the reinforcement, or consequence, if you will, can be both positive and negative. Positive reinforcement is given after the desired behavior. When you get the behavior you want to reinforce it. And it can be, I like just a sentence. I like the way this room is working so quietly. That's just a great job all of you are doing. That is a positive reinforcement. Negative on the other side can involve the removal of some negative thing, for example, following a desired. Now, this is negative reinforcement, negative reward. If they do something, let's say you guys have done so well in math, I'm not going to give you homework for this weekend. That's the removal of an aversive stimulus, something they don't want, following the desired behavior, which is what you do want. They learned that if I do this, I don't have to do that. You're removing something they don't like to do. That is a removal reward, as opposed to a presentation reward like a Skittle or a compliment. So there's both things are still rewards. They perceive them as rewards. Now, punishment on the other side of it, the negative consequences, are things that want to suppress the behavior. It's keeping them under your thumb. It's when you do apply something they don't like, following a behavior that you don't want. When I'll put it like it says on the slide here, it's an application of an unpleasant stimulus, something they don't want, or the withdrawal of something they do want, a pleasant reward, in an attempt to weaken this response, this negative behavior that you want. So you can have a plus or a minus, an addition or a subtraction, and they both can be a punishment. Here we are. Presentation punishment means, okay, if nobody has really done well, you're going to have to do not 1 through 25, but 1 through 40 in your math problems. That is a presentation, something they would perceive as a punishment. Although I hate to use adding homework as a reward or subtracting homework as a reward or a punishment, because it teaches students, especially when you use it as a punishment, it teaches students to associate homework with behavior. And I think you can find other methods to do that. However, the presentation punishment, if the students have messed up a classroom, left their table messy at the lunchroom, you can present them with the punishment. Fine, while the rest of us have our free play this afternoon, you guys are going to go back and clean that table in the lunchroom. So you're going to lose. So I'm presenting them with a punishment. The other side of it is removal punishment. If you left your table messy, now the lunch ladies have already cleaned that table up, but you guys are not going to get the free play. You're going to have to stay here and walk the fence at the playground while everybody else gets to go and swing on the swings or play the game that they want to play. So now I'm applying this primarily to elementary, but we can apply this to middle school and upper grades types of things too. When you remove something, it can be what I did with my middle school students sometimes. If they did not score well on their music tests, or if they didn't have their music memorized, then they didn't get to go to the contest. They didn't get to go on the trip. Bands do this all the time. You have to make a certain number of band practices, especially the last 2 or 3, or you don't get to go play for the football game. They perceive that as a removal punishment. Let's go on. Now, extinction I've pretty well covered. It's where you don't reinforce it either way. You don't reward it, you don't punish it. However, you have to be aware that someone else may be rewarding or punishing a behavior in the same realm. My point is, let's say you have a student who acts out in the classroom and you ignore it, but the students laugh at it. They have gotten their reward. And you have no control over that. So you may have to find some other method than extinction with a situation like that. Okay, here's that chart. That pretty well explains a little bit better. So you got reinforcements, which is rewards, and punishments on the other side. And notice the plus and minus on both sides. So if they gain something, they perceive it as a reward, something they want. If they lose something that they don't have to do, something they don't want to do, if they lose that, then they perceive it as a reward. Look, if they gain something, they perceive it as punishment. Notice they looks almost the same thing. It all has to do with how the student perceives it. In the punishment side, if they receive something, or if some other consequences apply that they don't want to have to do or they don't like, they perceive it as punishment. If they lose something that they wanted to do, they perceive it as punishment. So be aware of positive and negative reinforcement as well as punishment in the consequences. There are even types of ways of doing the rewards. There's the continuous schedule, where every time the good behavior is done, you reward it. It's tough when you try to keep that up. There's the intermittent schedule, which is you do it just occasionally. This usually happens very often after students have pretty well learned it. You just sort of do the reward again every now and then during the course of the year to sort of reinforce that. But even within the intermittent schedule, there are several different types. The ratio is based on the number of responses, number of times. Boys and girls, if I get 4 good reports back this week from the gym that you've done, or from the guidance counselor that you had a good class, then on the 5th day we're going to have a popcorn pie. That's based on a number, 4 out of 5. Whereas the interval is, if I don't get any negative reports for 2 weeks, anytime I get it for 2 weeks in a row, we're going to have a popcorn party. That's the way of doing an interval reinforcement. The variable one is pretty self-described. You do it whenever you want to do it, and the students don't know when they're going to get rewarded. The fixed one is the students know if we get 15 good stars from the lunchroom behavior chart, then we're going to get a reward. It's fixed on a certain exact number. The students know what they're shooting for. The problem with that is that if they know they don't have a chance, let's say they've got to have 20 stars and there's only 3 days left in the time period that you've set, the fixed time period, and they've only got 3 more days left, but they need 5 more stars, they know they don't have a shot, then you've got nothing left to hold over their heads, because they know they don't have a chance of making the goal. That's the problem with the fixed reinforcement. This is my revised chart here in terms of the ratio and interval. So this chart and the other one that I just showed you, I think you need to sort of get that in your mind in terms of what they are. In a ratio reinforcement, there's the fixed and the variable. In the interval, there's the fixed and the variable. Sound familiar? It's almost like the pluses and minuses in the other chart. But look at those and study this chart so that you can learn that the fixed ratio is set based on a number of responses, whereas the variable one is an unpredictable number. The fixed interval of interval responses is set for a particular time, as opposed to the variable one is unpredicted. The variable in both, yes, is not predicted. Look on in your books too about the types of reinforcement where the secondary thing or things, tangible objects could be what? What would be an example of a tangible object that you would give them as a reinforcement? Think about that. Think about what token reinforcers might be. That is usually tickets. That's what is the reinforcers that are used in many of the K-5 schools for accelerated reader. They get tickets for doing so many books or things like that. Then they can take that token and exchange it for trinkets at the bookstore, at the reward store. Social reinforcers could be permission or allowed to do certain things, social things, as a reward. The activity in reinforcement, we'll talk about this again, it's really interesting in the book. Sometimes it's called the grandmama rule, where if you finish your book here in time, or you finish your homework and I check it and it's fine, then you get extra free play time. Or you don't have to you don't have to do this next. If you finish this homework and you make an ace on it, you get to skip the next homework because you've already proved that you can do whatever it is we're learning. Those activity reinforcers are very popular with the social crowd. When you start getting to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, it is a very active type thing where if you deny them an activity, it is a powerful tool. So you have to be careful about that, because the social world is all of what middle schoolers are about. I like this thing called the shaping. I call it herding sometimes. It's where when students are first learning a behavior, you accept a wide variety of those behaviors as acceptable. Then as they've practiced that, you accept less and less of a variance from the exact behavior that you want. That is shaping them into the behavior that they want. It's like herding, like the dog with the sheep, trying to keep them herded in the right direction. Behavior modification is also called applied behavioral analysis, where we're going to look at that in just a moment, where you analyze the behavior. Here are the steps. First of all, you identify what is the behavior I want. Then identify the current behavior and also look at where and when and what. Now, I had a student in one of my classes who was misbehaving, and it turned out that she was allergic to something in the pizza sauce. So every time we had pizza or spaghetti, and I think it was sage, but it was some ingredient in the tomato sauce they were using, she was allergic to, and it changed her behavior only on those days. And it wasn't until we started really doing this type of analysis of this third part there, identifying the antecedents, what happened prior to that. Then we have to then set for the students, if it's not something that is medically related, then you establish the criteria for what is acceptable. Had a student who was wandering around from his desk a lot, and I literally put masking tape on the floor and said, as long as you stay within this square, then you're okay. And each week I would make that square, I would tape that square a little smaller. And the student, I used the herding instinct as well as establishing the criteria, but he knew exactly where he needed to be. So you have to then, when you apply this, and this is something you apply to an individual student, you create a system of rewards and punishments. I've had very often students who I worked this out with their parents, and they knew that they were going to get a sheet home at the end of the week about Johnny's behavior, and we would check off, and Johnny and I would sit down at the desk at the end of the day before he went to buses. Did you do X? Did you do Y? And went through that whole part, and he had to put that in his book bag and take it home, and it had to come back signed on Monday, or Johnny knew I was going to call Mom and ask about it in the first place. So, but you still have to create your system of what is rewards and what is punishments when you do an applied behavioral analysis. Here's a little bit more explanation of that. Once you identify the target behavior and then figure out what's wrong with that behavior, identify the current behavior and where they're doing it, look at how often it's wrong and what happened prior to that, establish the goal behavior, and look at the possible rewards. Now, I want to warn you about you've misbehaved, so off with you, down to the principal. When you send a student to the principal's office for their punishment or whatever happens, what you're saying to the student is that you don't have the power they do, the principal does. So why should they pay any attention to what you tell them in the first place? So be careful about just willy-nilly sending students off down to the office. Probably in the last 8 years that I taught, I sent maybe 2 students in the office, and both of those because they were doing, they had violated major school rules, violence. So most of the times, I tried to handle everything I possibly could. And if I didn't, before I went to the principal, I would even talk with the guidance counselor or the student's homeroom teacher or other teachers with that student to find things that I could use without having to send it down to someone else. I wanted the student to know I was the one with the power, not them. So let's look at the ups and downs of this. The strengths, the upside of it is that they work. The results are immediate. They are uniform. It happens. You can count on these things doing what they need to do. And you can use them for all ages. Nobody wants to not be rewarded for good work that they do. So everybody likes to have that. You and I like to have a good pat on the back for something that we do. And that reinforces us because we want to get those rewards again. It has tons of research behind it that says these things work. And the downside of it is the results may not last very long. As soon as the rewards go away, the behavior may change. It does not have any focus on self-control. There's no internal student reward. There's no student should learn this behavior. It's really based on, there's actually a verse in the Bible that says, train up a child in the way that they should go, and when they are old, they won't depart from that. Even the Bible has behavioral mod in it, saying that we should train a child in the way they do, and if we've done that, then when they get older, they won't depart from that. But we know how often that cannot be true with children when they grow up. But nonetheless, the downside of this, it doesn't involve an analysis of the real problem that the student may have, whether it is a medical, psychological, physical problem. It could be an outside behavior, influence, stimulus that's causing this misbehavior. A variety of different things, but it doesn't attach that. It only talks about here's what your behavior is and here's what the consequence is. So those are the 2 things it all involves. And once again, it reinforces that I'm going to do something because I'm going to get an outside reward, not because I need to do it and it's the right thing. So look at the key terms on the end of the chapter. Look at those chapter activities that's on page 38. And look at thinking about yourself in terms of how much of this is me. Am I going to be one of those rewards and consequences type person? And I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that this is wrong, because I have used these in a classroom. I know they're effective. So think about that. Read that philosophy of classroom management part at the bottom of page 38 in your text, and I think you'll get through that. So that pretty well covers it. I hope that's a short version of what the lecture would be. It's still a pretty good while. But finish this and go on and look into Chapter 3 as we continue on into classroom management. And I'll see you next time. Take care.